everyone, my name is Josh and welcome to WHIMs. And today I'm going to give you my top 10 list of favourite video games. So let's get right into it, no more delays, it's time to play. So for my number 10 spot, it will be Final Fantasy X. And Final Fantasy is a JRPG series from Square Enix. And for those of you who don't know what a JRPG is, it's basically a role-playing game from Japan. And it follows the character of Tidus, or Tidus, depending on how you want to pronounce it, what's your preference. He basically is an athlete in a game called Blitzball, which is effectively football or, dodgeball, but if it's done in a sort of like a bubble of water that's elevated off the ground. It's a very interesting sport visually to describe. It's very difficult to describe, but it's just something that's very spectacular visually. So he basically is on the home world of Speria, and while he's playing a game of Blitzball, a group or an armada of aliens known as Sin attack the city, and him, along with a group of ragtag survivors, have to basically figure out what the Sin want and where they actually came from. And this game is just spectacular, from the visuals to the characters to the gameplay style. It's basically like it's like a turn-based combat system whenever you're in combat with an enemy, where you get to use magic and special abilities, and you get to help and heal your team along the way and get special items. It's a very interesting game, but the story is really gripping and it has so many great twists and turns. And the character of Tidus is just such a likable hero that it's very hard not to, really root for him in a lot of different circumstances. It's a very compelling game. So that's my number 10, Final Fantasy X. And my number 9 is The Last of Us. Now, for those, I'm pretty sure a lot of people don't need for me to tell them the story of The Last of Us, since not long ago it was adapted into a TV series via HBO, starring Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey as Joel and Ellie from The Last of Us. And The Last of Us basically follows the story of a father who has just recently lost his daughter at the very beginning of this apocalypse, where these strange mutant creatures have basically overtaken due to something in the air and the plant life. So it's basically this fungus that's created these weird monstrous creatures known as clickers, and they're infected. They're not zombies, they're infected. And Joel has pretty much, throughout his course of the apocalypse, before the apocalypse even started, he lost his faith in humanity when a misunderstanding with the military personnel ends up leading to him losing his daughter Sarah in a very emotional scene at the very start of the game. And this game is absolutely spellbinding. It's powerful, it's suspenseful, it's got great dialogue and great action set pieces, but it's also very gripping. And what's really wonderful about this game, as well as the show, is you really do kind of start to see that the clickers aren't the worst thing that humanity has to deal with in trying to get itself back together. Sometimes humanity is at its most destructive when it's at war with them, when they're at war with themselves, effectively. And that's effectively what The Last of Us plays with. It's the idea of, how much of humanity can still be maintained even after when most of the world has basically fallen to ruin. And it's such an incredible game. I would highly recommend it. It's a fantastic game. It's a fantastic thrill ride. I haven't played part 2 yet, but I'm really looking forward to it, and I'm looking forward to checking out the series in its entirety. But yeah, I really am looking forward to talking about that more as time goes on. I will be doing a video of the Last of Us TV series at some point. But that's my number 9, The Last of Us, and my number 8 is both Ico and Shadow of the Colossus. And both these games are very important because they basically are atmospheric pieces. They rely more on mood and atmosphere rather than a standard straightforward narrative. It's more like a sort of Jodorowsky type film, sort of like, the guided films like The Holy Mountain and what have you. It's more like what would happen if he made a video game, effectively, where it's very abstract, it's very much more artistically driven than story driven, and the story is more or less reflective of just one person or two people going across an environment which are basically more or less fallen down ruins that they basically have to traverse through whilst also fighting monsters and solving environmental puzzles. They're very gripping games, but I think Shadow of the Colossus is the one that really tops them all, because Shadow of the Colossus actually has a very compelling story where a young man, after his lover has pretty much fallen into a coma, she's dying, and he has to basically defeat the 13 colossi in order to maintain her life force so that she can live on and give life back to the earth. It's a very fantastic story, but then of course you get to see these magnificent titans known as the colossi, who are essentially the most horrific looking beasts, but they're also the most spectacular and the most beautiful beasts you'll ever see in a video game. It's really wonderful because you really do feel the scale of these monsters, and you really do feel, as time goes on, you feel very small as the main hero, Wanderer, when you're actually going through this entire landscape and you're actually seeing these giant Titan-esque creatures. It's a fantastic game with a very gripping hook, and it is very beautifully done, and of course the music is absolutely spectacular. The game is just gorgeous. Like, I was playing it on my PS3 and the graphics are astounding. So that's my number 8, Ico. And of course Ico is the prequel to Shadow of the Colossus, where you play as a boy who has to essentially escort a girl who has special abilities across a very deserted landscape, whilst also trying to traverse, rocky terrains, and also fight shadow creatures along the way. It's essentially the same story, where you have to basically traverse through a very ruined landscape in order to save the world. And they're both really good games, very atmospheric, very beautifully, realised in terms of design and story. And that's my number 8, Ico and Shadow of the Colossus. And my number 7 is The Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion. Now, The Elder Scrolls is is a video game series, which is essentially a role-playing game series, an RPG series, set in a fantasy world called Cyrodiil. And in Cyrodiil, there's all sorts of different races of people, all sorts of different classes of people, like mages, warriors, knights, royalty, and various other people. But there's also different races, like a Khajiit, which is essentially a tiger person that's basically sentient, sort of like an anthropomorphic tiger. And there's various other races that I can't mention because their names escape me. But there's a couple of amphibian type creatures as well. There's all sorts of different races of people. And this story of Oblivion, you follow a nameless protagonist that you can customize on your own. And he has to basically, after being released from prison, he has to follow the instructions of the Emperor Uriel Septime, who's voiced by Patrick Stewart, Jean-Luc Picard, and Professor Xavier himself, to essentially find his heir, whilst also trying to close the gates of Oblivion. And he has to escort a precious item called the Amulet of Kings to a place called Waylon Priory, where the heir to the Uriel Septime throne it resides. And this game, it might sound like a very straightforward Star Wars hero's journey or Lord of the Rings type of story, but the way the story unravels and all the different quests that you get to have in between this main story are absolutely wonderfully realised. And this game came out in 2007, and although it may not have aged well in terms of graphics, it does still have its own charm. The voice acting is absolutely wonderful. I get chills whenever I hear, the voice actors in this game, and I just really love the dialogue, and I love the characters as well. And I genuinely am really excited whenever I hear that opening theme music. Like, if you look up on YouTube the opening theme music or the main menu music for Elder Scrolls Oblivion, you will definitely feel it gives me that Game of Thrones vibe, where I immediately get chills as soon as I hear it. It's one of those wonderful things. And I just have a lot of fun with these games. And I just love the world building, and I love the story. I love Skyrim too, but I absolutely love Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, because that got me into the Elder Scrolls series, and I do hold it in a very special place on my mantle of favourite video games. So that's my number 7, Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion. My number 6 is Castlevania 64. Now, Castlevania 64 is a very interesting case, because the Castlevania series started off as a 2D side-scrolling series where you have to control a vampire hunter as he traverses Dracula's castle, and the main end game is always Dracula. Dracula's the final boss, and mostly the Castlevania series hasn't really done very well in other avenues, but just recently they made a television series about the Castlevania series, and they've also made a spin-off series called Nocturne, which is a fantastic series, I'm sure, but I haven't actually checked it out yet. I've only just started the first series. So yes, but the Castlevania 64 was the first go around of the creators at Konami to create a 3D Castlevania game. And this was in the wake of video games like Mario 64 and Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. So I think, what other video game series that we have in 2D, like a 2D side-scrolling game that we haven't made into 2D yet that needs to be made into 3D? Well, check out Castlevania 64 and see how that goes. But this game, when it first came out, didn't really get a lot of good reviews. A lot of people hated it. A lot of people said it was the worst game ever. The controls are very wonky and all over the place. And the game doesn't really know where it wants to go or what it wants to be. So the essential premise of the game is you play as two characters by the name of Reinhard Beaumont, and who's basically the next in line of this long line of vampire hunters called the Belmont clan, who are the Guardians of the Light, and they're basically holy men who have this mission to destroy all evil. And you have Carrie Fernandez, a Romani woman who is tasked with defeating evil after essentially vampires, werewolves, and all sorts of other supernatural beings wiped out her Romani family, a traveller family. And it really is quite compelling. Both characters' stories are really compelling, and you really do go on a journey with these characters to sort of defeat the ultimate in evil. But this game is fabulous. I love the opening level of the Forest of Silence. It has such great atmosphere and such great, build up to the ultimate, terror. But when you get closer and closer to the story, you really, to the main end where you have to eventually confront Dracula, there's so many great twists and turns along the way, and I was just really spellbound throughout the majority of this game's runtime. And I just love all the characters. I love Rinon, the demon lawyer. I really do love him. And I know that sounds weird, saying the words demon and lawyer in the same sentence, but the fact that he's kind of like this demon lawyer who doffs his top hat to you whenever he meets you, and he's basically this guy that when you meet him, you pick up a contract, and whenever you select this contract in your options, or whenever you find them about levels, you can basically buy items and keep them in storage. But if you buy too many items off of him, at the very end of the game, he becomes a boss. So that's actually a very interesting twist to the scenario. And there's so many great monsters in this. Like, there's the Wolfman, there's like a Frankenstein gardener with a chainsaw for a hand. Sorry, I just knocked my fan over. Sorry about that. But yeah, this game's so fabulous. I absolutely love it. I love the music as well. I think the music is fabulous. My favourite musical piece from this particular game is the opening titles, the main title theme with a character playing the violin. That's one of my favourite pieces. And it made me want to take up playing the violin at one point in my life, believe it or not. So that was actually quite interesting. But I also like the theme for Castle Center, which is the third level in the game. It's a really good piece. If you look up the theme for Castle Center, Castlevania 64, and you hear it, it's actually a really badass game. I'd highly recommend checking out that track. So that's my number 6, Castlevania 64. And my number 5 is Silent Hill. And like I said in my original review for the film version of Silent Hill, it was based on a video game by Konami, who originally, when they first got the pitch to make a Silent Hill game or a survival horror game, their higher-ups basically said, we need to make something that's going to contend with Resident Evil. But what Silent Hill does differently, and why I think it's probably a little bit better than Resident Evil, in my opinion. I still love Resident Evil, by the way, but I just think Silent Hill is my favourite, because unlike Resident Evil, where you follow special forces groups like Leon and Claire and all these other characters, Silent Hill basically follows ordinary people who are just found in this very bizarre situation where they have to go through this very supernatural landscape submerged in fog, and they have to essentially just survive and try to get through to the other end without dying. And that's one of the things that I really like about Silent Hill, is they're all regular people. Like the first game follows the character of Harry Mason, who is trying to look for his daughter Cheryl, who's just gone missing after they've arrived in the town of Silent Hill. The second game follows the character of James Sunderland, who has basically returned to Silent Hill after he receives a letter from his thought to be long deceased wife Mary, and he goes through this very long labyrinth of trying to figure out what's actually going on. It's a really compelling series, and I don't really have a specific entry for this particular list, but I think both games are really wonderful and they're worth checking out. But that's my number 5, Silent Hill. And my number 4 is Bioshock. And Bioshock is a video game that I actually reviewed on this channel a long time ago. But that was actually the review that actually stopped me making video game reviews on the whole, because I was actually very kind of disheartened after it didn't get many likes. But I do think this game is one of my favourites because it has one of the best world building settings, an underwater city called Rapture, which sort of has this sort of mid 1950s flair to it. And the story's just really compelling. You play a survivor of a plane crash named Jack, who finds himself in the underwater city of Rapture, and he sort of gets submerged in this very kind of horrific landscape that's occupied by these very mutated beings known as splicers, who sort of become addicted to this substance called Adam, and this sort of genetic substance that makes them superhuman, but also quite deformed and quite, monstrous looking. And it's a very incredibly compelling idea, and the story is well done. And what I love about this game is you really are just sort of it's a story that pretty much is set all in one location. It's set in Rapture, and you have all these different subsections and subsidiary sections of the city to explore as you go deeper and deeper through the game, and you really are just sort of going along for the ride, and you're basically being navigated with the help of a survivor and a colleague of the Rapture committee called Atlas, who keeps giving you instructions, and like any old video game player, you follow those rules without any real, question. But the game actually does something very clever with that, which I won't spoil, but I will definitely say it's worth checking out with that little tidbit in mind. But I really, really would recommend Rapture. It's an amazing game, and it really is one of those games that I absolutely just love. Whenever I hear the song Beyond the Sea by Bobby Darin, I think of Rapture. I think of, electrocuting splicers and whacking them with wrenches and hacking into guardrail machines so that I can, destroy Big Daddies and things like that. Big Daddies are effectively these big monstrous creatures that have been made by humans who have to basically safeguard the only reliable source of Adam, which are these little sisters, which are these children, mostly little girls, who have this ability to harbour Adam within their DNA. And a lot of splicers, because Adam is so addictive, they have basically, all the splicers are after Adam, and they're after these little sisters. So Big Daddies have to basically be on their side to help them whenever they come into trouble. And it's a really good world-building sort of society. It's a very compelling game. It's very gripping. It's very dark, but it's also very fun to play as well. So that's my number 4, and that's Bioshock. So my number 3 is the Kingdom Hearts series. And the Kingdom Hearts series is sort of a spin-off of the Final Fantasy series, where instead of basically getting your very familiar cast of characters, a select few Final Fantasy characters make cameos in the Kingdom Hearts games. But for the most part, it's an original story. And what the story of Kingdom Hearts is, in its most simple term, because as the series goes on, it gets even more complicated, Kingdom Hearts follows the story of Sora, who, after his friends have been separated, he has to go on a journey to try to find them again. And this is when the world has sort of been overshadowed by these shadowy creatures known as Heartless, who are trying to basically destroy people by taking away their hearts and corrupting them effectively. And Sora is sort of a chosen one who is meant to wield this keyblade, this massive sword that's essentially in the shape of a key, to lock and unlock the worlds, all the doorways to all these different worlds. And He's not just doing it alone either, he's doing it with some of the most beloved characters in Disney history, and that is Donald and Goofy. They actually help him on his journey, and all the different worlds that he goes to defend from the Heartless, these shadowy creatures, are worlds from Disney films. Like there's a world dedicated to Alice in Wonderland, there's a world dedicated to Tarzan, there's a world dedicated to all these different characters, there's a world dedicated to Peter Pan. So many great, Disney characters and Disney IPs are actually featured in this game series, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger no matter how many entries you have in the series. It's absolutely fabulous and it's such a good time. If the story wasn't perfect, which it is in my opinion, the game would still be fun, but I absolutely think the story is phenomenal. I think Tetsuya Nomura is such a fantastic writer and director, and he does feel like the video game equivalent of George Lucas. He has such an incredible imagination, but sometimes he can let his imagination run away with him, because in later installments the plot gets very complicated and there's so many twists and turns. But I absolutely love this series. It's one of my favourites. I actually had a poster of this series at one point, but I don't know where it's gone to. But yeah, I really do love this series. It's my number 3, the Kingdom Hearts series. And my number 2, before we round things off, is the Arkham trilogy. And the Arkham trilogy, the Batman Arkham trilogy, is effectively Batman trying to save the land of the sort of land of Arkham from his rogues gallery, like the Joker, like the Penguin, like Scarecrow. And in the first game, Arkham Asylum, Batman, it's pretty much business as usual for Batman. He's escorting the Joker to Arkham Asylum, but while he's en route to getting him locked up and incarcerated, he ends up being falling victim to a bit of a sabotage where the Joker has intentionally rigged the security and various other people and replaced various staff members with goons of his, like various henchmen of his, in an attempt to overtake Arkham Asylum. Excuse me. And the entire game is a survival horror game, but with Batman as your lead. And that's one of the things that was quite an interesting hook. And it is a really frightening game. It really is quite effective. It's very atmospheric. It's very beautifully, designed. All the levels feel absolutely pitch perfect. There's several scary sequences involving one of my favourite Batman villains, the Scarecrow, which I thought was absolutely phenomenal. But I love the Arkham trilogy, especially Arkham City. Arkham City number 2 has one of the best twist endings ever. So if that's not enough of a hook to get you invested in this video game series, I don't know what will. It's a Batman video game survival horror series. What more can you ask for, eh? And before I get to my number 1, here are a few honourable mentions. Uncharted, and this is basically an adventure game along the lines of something like the Mummy, Brendan Fraser Mummy films, or the Indiana Jones series, but it has a lot more of a more grittier and more darker vibe. It is very fun. It's by Don't Nod Entertainment, who also did the video game The Last of Us and the Crash Bandicoot games. It's a very good series of games. The hero of the series, Nathan Drake, is really compelling. This is also a game that that recently got turned into a film adaptation, and I absolutely love them. I think they're absolutely wonderful. They're very gripping. They're very well written. They've got great characters. And I just think they're fabulous. They're all really wonderful. And another honourable mention is Life is Strange. And Life is Strange is effectively a choose your own adventure time travel story, but told from the point of view of a teenager, Max Caulfield, who returns to her hometown of Arcadia Bay after a long absence. But when she encounters a very traumatic event in the bathroom while she's, taking recess one day, she realises that she can rewind powers. So her, along with her old high school friend, Chloe Price, they actually go on a bit of an adventure together to try to figure out what happened to a missing teenager who happened to be a friend of Chloe's, called Rachel Dawes. And this particular game is absolutely gripping. It has one of the most, compelling stories I've ever seen in a video game in recent years. It's really compelling. It's very heartfelt. And I have to say, this game made me cry when I first played it. It really was a beautiful insight into the life of a teenager and what problems teenagers have on a daily basis, the pressures that they have, and they really do encapsulate all these different things in a wonderful little bundle. It's also a bit of a sci-fi romp as well, and a little bit of a murder mystery as well. So it's got all those compelling elements, and that's my honorable mentions. And one more honorable mention before we wrap this up and get to number one is Mario 64. This was the first ever 3D Mario game to ever be made, and this game was a very huge game for me because this was probably one of the first video games that I ever played, and it's a really fun game. It's very great. It's very colourful. It's a great game to introduce to kids if you want to, get them into video games. This is a great game to start off with because it's very light-hearted, very easy. It's very very selective in terms of what worlds and what tasks you get to do. You have to get stars so that Mario can go from one world to the next and one level to the next, because he's in a castle effectively and he's trying to rescue Princess Peach from Bowser or King Koopa, and he effectively is trying to do that whilst also getting these power stars which will help him progress throughout the castle. And it's great to introduce children to, because if you don't like one world, or if you find one world too challenging, you can go to another world. And there's a world underwater, there's a world in a snow landscape, there's a world in a sand sort of place like a desert, or there's also a fire world. There's so many different worlds to choose from, and that's Mario 64. It's fabulous. I'd highly recommend it. And my number one is The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Now, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time is one of the first games that I ever played. This one, along with Mario 64, were sort of the first video games I ever played when we first got, as a family, a Nintendo 64. And The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, I did a review of this a long time ago, but this game is just wonderful. From its opening theme music, to its story, to its characters, to its mechanics. This game is just really fabulous, and I just really love playing this game from time to time, and it's a really compelling play. You play as a boy called Link, who is a Kokiri fairy child, and he lives in a place called Kokiri Forest, where all the children in residence are essentially all children. They never age and they never grow up, and they all have fairy companions, except Link. And one day he gets himself a fairy companion in the form of Navi, or Navi, and she gives him a special task to do, where she simply just comes to him and says, "Hey Link, you've got a very special appointment with the Deku Tree. Get up now, you lazy boy." And then that's how the game pretty much starts. And not only does he have a very special job to do for the Great Deku Tree, but this basically spirals into an entirely wonderful, compelling adventure where he has to save the world and the land of Hyrule, which is the entirety of this fantasy setting in which this game is set. And what it seems like it is at first is a very straightforward hero's journey, a very straightforward monomyth story, like the hero's journey kind of thing, where there's a chosen one involved. But halfway through the game, there's a bit of a twist, and the twist is that you pull this sword from the stone, which is called the Master Sword, in a place called the Temple of Time. And when you pull the sword from the stone as a child, you grow up into a man, and you realise that 10 years have passed and you've been sealed away in the Temple of Time whilst the world has effectively ended and you've failed your mission. So now you've got to basically right the wrong, where you've basically been absent for 10 years and you've got to try to basically fix the problems that this main bad guy called Ganondorf has created. And it's such an incredibly interesting twist on things, and that's my number one. And that's my list for the top 10 favourite video games of all time. I hope you guys enjoyed this list, and let me know what your video games are in the comments. And what did you think of this list? Did this give you an insight into video games and a deeper appreciation for video games in terms of story? Or has it made you want to pick up a video game and actually give it a go and try to give something more story driven? What was your thoughts on this list? Let me know in the comments, and if you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up, and I hope you're all doing very well. This has been Josh with WHIMs, and take care. Bye bye for now.